Right.
Mhm.
So, as we know, for last week and this week, and then for the final class next week, we're framing everything through the lens of Lama Tsongkhapa's short Lam Rim prayer, the foundation of all good qualities. We're using those stanzas to explore kind of all of the teachings of the Buddha. So, we are on to the next. So the next stanza is seeking samsaric pleasures is the door to all suffering. They are uncertain and cannot be relied upon. Recognizing these shortcomings, please bless me to generate the strong wish for the bliss of liberation. So with this, we are moving on to the middle scope. We covered karma, toward the end of last week. And now we're moving into the teachings that generate renunciation or definite emergence, the wish to definitely emerge from suffering. So we talked about how there's a version of renunciation on the small scope where a person might feel that engaging in certain unethical actions might be a good way to kind of manipulate people, get what they want, amass power, property, and so on by stealing it or by being deceitful, by being manipulative. Many people on the earth try to amass wealth and power that way, but a practitioner of the small scope turns away from that way of existing, that way of relating to others, because they understand the long-term consequences. Certainly if you successfully rob a bank and you don't get caught and, you don't go to prison, then sure, you've got millions of dollars to spend, over the course of that one lifetime. But a practitioner of the small scope is going to understand that the long-term consequences in terms of future lives makes that unethical way of relating just not worth it. And so they might see, well, sure, if I manipulate or if I act deceitfully, we see some people in the world seemingly not experiencing consequences for those sorts of behaviors and maybe being powerful or being rich by engaging in non-virtue, but the long-term consequences beyond just one life make it so that a practitioner of the small scope would, understanding, as we talked about the law of karma, the law of cause and effect, they would turn away, they would restrain themselves from acting in that way. But a practitioner of the middle scope is someone who is not seeking any kind of ordinary cyclic existence type of rebirth at all as a good in and of itself. So here it talks about samsaric pleasures being the door to all suffering. So here this is talking about getting caught up in any kind of enjoyment of the senses, any kind of, chasing after food, after, drink, after comfort, after status, after wealth, after reputation, all of the things that and again, if we go back to the Four Noble Truths and we look at the three kinds of suffering, um, the suffering, the suffering of change. This is really talking about the suffering of change, that, that any kind of ordinary enjoyment isn't true happiness, isn't real happiness. It itself becomes uncomfortable in the future. So, um, as it says, they are uncertain and cannot be relied upon because they are not in the nature of happiness. They are in the nature of the suffering of change. And so this practitioner is beginning to really focus on that aspect of cyclic existence, the aspect of changeable suffering. um, and recognizing that there are no pleasures within cyclic existence that are true, genuine, real, lasting happiness. So it says, please bless me to generate the strong wish for the bliss of liberation. And so liberation is getting at, one of these two doorways, the doorway of lower nirvana or the doorway of full enlightenment. That's the bliss of liberation that is beyond cyclic existence, beyond just taking rebirth under the influence of past karma and delusion or affliction, which if that's what we continue to do indefinitely, if we continue to experience um, the results of past karma and delusion throwing us into additional samsaric rebirths again and again and again, then we will be unable to experience real, genuine, true, lasting, perfect happiness. But, lower nirvana, full enlightenment, those are the pathways of liberation that the Buddha taught, that are real, genuine, lasting happiness. And that comes about by kind of deepening that renunciation that was begun on the small scope. That small scope practitioner looks at a certain group of actions that are unethical and says, I will turn away from acting in the world in that way. And that's a form of renunciation. This practitioner is saying, well, I'm also going to turn away from grasping at or chasing after samsaric pleasures, um, because I recognize that just like the small scope practitioner recognizes the shortcomings of unethical behaviors and the consequences of unethical behaviors, giving rise to the most intense kinds of suffering, the middle school practitioner recognizes that chasing after worldly enjoyment traps them into a cycle of rebirth within cyclic existence. That practitioner, as long as they feel like there is some way of making cyclic existence work out, meaning, if um, if you could just get the right partner or the right job or the right level of wealth or the right level of comfort or the right level of social, um, respect or power, then you would be happy. Then you really would um, achieve real happiness. As an American, they call that the American dream. When you're a successful doctor or lawyer or titan of industry, whatever it might be, then thinking of that as the goal, thinking of that as what I'm striving after, the point, the purpose of my life is to get those things. That way of relating, just like the way of relating to others unethically to get what one might want, this way isn't necessarily unethical. There isn't necessarily anything unethical about, spending a lot of time and energy and effort pursuing wealth, pursuing power, pursuing status, but it traps a person into the pattern of additional future samsaric rebirths. And that in and of itself is disadvantageous as compared to liberation, as compared to one of these tracks that the Buddha taught, where you do actually achieve real, genuine, lasting happiness. So you basically meditate on or you contemplate that, you know, that topic again and again and again, and you deeply familiarize your mind with this, just like you previously deeply familiarized your mind with turning away from non-virtue, because for all of us, when if we were to find, for example, maybe some really, um, you know, a bag of cocaine or a bag of methamphetamine, right? We would just be like, well, I should call the police. I should, we wouldn't be like, oh, that's great. Like I have free cocaine. I have free. So let me, because we understand like it's not a struggle. It's not difficult for us to turn away from that because we see in our society the ravages of that kind of addiction. We see how incredibly harmful it is that people die, people lose, everything when they do that sort of thing. Um, so, and that's just familiarity, right? That's just, we see that in our world. We've been exposed to that from a very young age. So we easily can turn away from that kind of action. And so this is all just the same kind of familiarization, the same kind of mental training where, we have to start by thinking about non-virtue. We have to start by thinking about I shouldn't lie, I shouldn't kill, I shouldn't, not because the Buddha said it, but because of the consequences, because of the results, because of what it brings. Um, and we're just deepening that process here on the middle scope by recognizing that we don't really want future lifetimes within cyclic existence, except that we may need some additional human lifetimes if we don't finish practicing, if we don't achieve enlightenment in this lifetime, well, then we'll need another lifetime to continue practicing. But the purpose is just to have the right conditions to continue practicing, not because we are so excited about, being able to eat more food, being able to be in, relationships. Not, it's not the pleasures of cyclic existence that are attractive to us. It's just that, well, I didn't accomplish my goal, and so I just need more time before that goal can be accomplished. But I'm still focused on this end result, this end goal of liberation. And I just am like, well, didn't happen in this life, so, it's okay. I just need to, make sure that I'm creating the causes of more opportunities to practice. So then the next verse, led by this pure thought, so the pure thought of seeking liberation, mindfulness, alertness, and great caution arise. So this is talking about kind of introspection, because we have to, if we want to, this mindfulness, alertness, and great caution is talking about guarding our karma, guarding our, decisions, our choices, are what we, on the basis of really being aware of, that it isn't something that's being imposed from the outside, that no one is judging, no one is, it's just cause and effect, right? If you create the causes, if you put all of the causes together for, for example, a really suffering rebirth by engaging in, non-virtue and not purifying it, um, then you've assembled those causes, and then that result comes from that. And if you assemble the causes of, just more and more future lifetimes within cyclic existence by getting caught up in samsaric pleasure, then you've assembled those causes, and then that result will arise. Um, so this is talking about, it says the root of the teachings is keeping the pratimoksha vows. The pratimoksha means the vows of individual liberation, the vows, the five um, lay vows or the vows of a monk or a nun, whatever the vehicle that a person is using. Um, so that's what this is saying, is that those ethical teachings are the foundation of our practice, and they should always be the foundation of our practice. Okay, so that covers the middle scope, just just that, because we said the middle scope is renunciation, the middle, and of course, I mean, there's multiple chapters on that, that if a person were to read practicing the path or the Lamrim Chenmo. Of course, there's a lot of detail with how that is accomplished, but renunciation and guarding your karma in terms of, you know, really being aware of the results of what your body, your speech, and your mind are getting involved in, and doing so with the interest in avoiding creating these causes just mindlessly or heedlessly, additional, rebirths. That's the whole purpose of the middle scope from the perspective of a Mahayana practitioner. So now we go right to the great scope, which is unique to the Mahayana tradition. So um, this verse begins by saying, this is my existential condition. Just as I have fallen into the sea of samsara, so have all mother migratory beings. So this idea of mother migratory beings is the idea, the understanding that, and this is presented as just literally true from the Buddhist perspective, that, because as we've talked about, the mind is beginningless and endless. So this mind that is associated with this particular physical form for this lifetime was associated with a different physical form right before this lifetime. That lifetime had a time limit of whatever it was. And then before that, there was another lifetime which had a time limit and so on. And that process is beginningless. So, and then it's understood that the total number of sentient beings, although it's nearly infinite, nearly limitless, is not completely limitless, is not truly mathematically infinite. Because there's a general understanding that it's possible that at some point in the future, all sentient beings can achieve enlightenment. And so, if you had a truly infinite number of sentient beings, then you'd always have more ordinary, you would never drain that group into, the group of enlightened beings. So there's an incredibly vast, uncountable, you know, number of minds of sentient beings, but it's not genuinely mathematically truly infinite. But the number of past lives is truly infinite. There's no time at which our consciousness didn't exist and it wasn't incarnating, it wasn't taking rebirths. So mother migratory beings is referring to the understanding that every other sentient being has played the role of one's own mother countless times. We don't always have mothers in different, because some of the forms of existence just they don't require birth, in that they're energetic forms. They don't require a mother and a father in order to exist because they're energetic in nature. Um, but given that previous lives are infinite, there's a sufficient number of the lifetimes that you did require a mother and a father in order to take birth into that realm. Um, so it's a math problem, right? Given, X number of previous lives and Y number of existent sentient beings, literally every insect, every fish, every dog, every cat, every human, every mosquito, every ant, they all have minds that are associated with the form, but that same mind was the form of our mother countless times, in the past, given an infinite number of rebirths on our part and on their part. Um, so that way of thinking is meant to help us to develop an interest in working for the best. It's one way. We'll talk about the two ways of training the mind in bodhicitta, um, but this is kind of introducing the first of the two, um, and which is the 6-point cause and effect, and that's based on this idea of seeing all sentient beings as having been one's mother as a way of feeling close to them, as a way of, seeing them in a way that naturally gives rise to that. Um, okay. So this is now that we're on the great scope, this is really focused on bodhicitta, which is uh, the unique aspect of the great scope. Bodhicitta is the wish to achieve enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings without exception. Um, Bodhi means awakening, and citta means mind. So the word itself translates into English as the mind of awakening or the mind of enlightenment. But the meaning of bodhicitta, I mean, that phrasing itself doesn't really tell you very much about what it means, but what it does mean is the aspiration, the wish, the intention to achieve full enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings without exception. Um, so we're going to then talk about training the mind in bodhicitta, um, training the mind, becoming someone. You've probably heard the phrase bodhisattva, right? A person who has a genuine, uncontrived, meditative realization of bodhicitta, of this. So what that means is that this person, a bodhi, because sattva means person. So bodhisattva is a person who's so deeply familiar with bodhicitta that it becomes their sort of baseline state of being, meaning that every action of body, speech, and mind from, morning until night, and even, they would say, even in their dreams, they are only motivated by bodhicitta. There's no other, they have no other reason for existing other than to achieve enlightenment, not for oneself, but for the benefit of all sentient beings. Um, and by the way, in doing that, oneself does achieve one's own highest welfare because one achieves full enlightenment. So you don't, it isn't that you enter into some sort of suffering state in order to benefit sentient beings. You yourself are achieving enlightenment, which is the highest welfare for oneself. But the reason that a person is motivated to accomplish that state isn't for one's own benefit. It is because a fully enlightened being is a being that can use that state of enlightenment to enter back into cyclic existence again and again and lead ordinary sentient beings um, out of that state of being trapped in cyclic existence. They can lead them to their enlightenment, and that's the motivating force. But the good news is that you still also accomplish your own highest welfare, by you yourself also being enlightened. And um, uh, if you don't achieve that, then your ability to be of benefit is limited. Your ability, because you're also, right now, as an ordinary sentient being, we ourselves are subject to hatred. We ourselves are subject to jealousy and maliciousness and ill will, and and which is normal, like all sentient beings. It's just because we're ordinary. We get, we fly into rages sometimes. We say hurtful things sometimes because our mind is obscured, our mind is ordinary. And so, if we stay like that, then we will lack the ability to be of real benefit to others. We have some benefit. We can learn some things. We can work on our mind. We can be of some benefit, but we can't ultimately really be of benefit to sentient beings until we ourselves achieve enlightenment. And then when we ourselves are completely free of all of those obscurations, all of those afflicted states of being, then we can be of perfect, limitless benefit to sentient beings. Um, but until then, our ability to help is pretty limited. Just like if a person looked at the world and they saw, all of the suffering of cancer or heart disease, until they become, the a foremost expert in that disease, what can they really do? Like they haven't really developed the skills, the ability. They might be able to give people, literature about that, or they might be able to help educate people about, diet or exercise, but they don't really know all of the details. And so they're just giving people kind of generic, not that helpful advice. It's sort of, similar to that. We have to ourselves really achieve this result, and then, and only then, is our ability to help, really manifest. So when we're talking about training in bodhicitta, there is a step that, on the Great Scope, there is a step that happens before being able to train in bodhicitta, which is equanimity. Um, so equanimity means that we have equal regard for all sentient beings, that um, we don't discriminate, or we don't prefer some sentient beings over other sentient beings. And that's, again, a very ordinary way of thinking, a very ordinary way of putting people into categories. And the categories here are what they call friend, enemy, and stranger. These are the three baskets that we tend to put people in. Um, so when a person, someone outside of ourselves, when they have neither benefited us nor done anything to harm us, then we would say, well, that's a stranger. They're just, I see them, down the street, walking on the other side of the street, or I see them in the grocery store, and they're kind of just in the background. I'm not particularly, interested in their lives. I'm not, they're just sort of wallpaper to my life. Um, and as long as they don't say anything unkind, or, cut me off into traffic, because very quickly, if that person acted in a rude way, acted in an unkind way, we would then begin to label. I mean, the word enemy in English is a bit strong, but it basically just means someone that we um, find difficult, someone that we have some conflict with, someone that we feel a sense of aversion toward. And so if that stranger comes up to us and they start being insulting, they start saying, really unkind things, very quickly our mind would feel a sense of aversion. We would want to get away from that person. We would want to remove ourselves. And even we might become angry. We might also retaliate. We might respond also with unkind. We might respond with harm. We might respond to harm with harm, saying, "How dare you?" And we might even get, physical. We might push that person, or, if we get really worked up. So that's the idea of the enemy, which just means someone who triggers aversion in our mind because of the way that they act, their behaviors, their choices. Um, they act in a way, and sometimes it's just, um, and it could be that they're not acting toward us in that way, but maybe we are aware that they committed, crimes or something, and we see them as, oh, that's a criminal. That person, they did terrible things to other people. So I feel aversion toward that person. They make me feel unsafe. They haven't done anything. We don't really know them, but someone said, "Oh, that person, they stole things from other people, or they committed a murder or something." So we just say, "Oh, well, that's a murderer. That's a thief," and so I don't know their name, I don't know their history, I don't know anything about them, but I'm averse to that. I want to be separated from them. I don't have any sense of closeness toward them. I don't have any warmth toward them. I just see them as someone to stay away from, someone to be aversive toward. So it isn't they don't necessarily have to do anything directly to us, but for whatever reason, in our own mind, they trigger aversion in us. Um, and sometimes, we get that kind of feeling even for no reason at all. And from the Buddhist perspective, they would say that we maybe have some sort of karmic, we just feel uneasy about someone, that we share an elevator with someone and like, they just rub us the wrong way just instantly. And we feel that kind of aversion. From the Buddhist perspective, they said that that is often because in past lives we have, negative maybe they did harm us in a past life, and so kind of energetically, there's a karmic sort of thing happening there. So those the enemy, people who trigger aversion, and then we have friends, and friends are people who we do feel like is someone that has worked for our benefit, that they agree with us about things, they see things in a similar way to how we see them. They maybe they vote for the same people that we vote for. They want society to look the same way that we want society to look. They say kind things to us. They go out of their way to do nice things for us. They show an interest in us. We feel supported by them. Um, and so they become our friends. And the problem with these categories of friend, enemy, and stranger is that, from our side, if a person is a friend, then we find it easy to try to benefit, to want to benefit them. We find it, it comes easily for us to reciprocate the kindness that we feel like they have shown us by showing them kindness. Um, if it's a stranger, maybe if depending on what they need, what is happening that day. If it's not a big deal, if it's, like if someone drops something, in the grocery store, sure, yeah, we'll pick it up for them. We might help them, if their purse spills, and we might stop and like help them collect their things because it's a nice thing to do. But if they asked us to help them move, probably not. We're probably not leaving the grocery store and going to their apartment and packing up their furniture for them and helping them, move their apartment. Um, but if our best friend says, "Hey, I'm moving on Saturday, would you come over?" Then yeah, we would probably do that. Um, and then it gets worse with respect to the enemy, with respect to people that we feel like have harmed us. We are extremely unlikely to be motivated to do anything to benefit that person, right? Anyone in that category, anyone that triggers aversion in our mind, the idea of going out of our way to work for their benefit is pretty unlikely, because they trigger aversion for us. So, and that's the sort of default state that we're all in, that we have this tendency to put everyone that we meet into one of these three categories: friend, enemy, and stranger. So that's a real obstacle to this idea of bodhicitta, right? This idea of, because bodhicitta, right, is the wish to achieve enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings without exception. So we can't leave anyone out, regardless of how they treat us, regardless of what their behavior is in the world, whether they're a serial killer or an arsonist or a megalomaniac that's wreaking havoc in the world. Doesn't matter from that perspective. We wish to achieve enlightenment in order to be of benefit to that sentient being because we understand that all sentient beings at different times are engaging in those sorts of harmful actions, right? I mean, we ourselves in many past lives, the causes and the conditions came together in that life for ourselves. I mean, and by ourselves, I mean the mind that is associated with this form is the same continuity of mind that was associated with that form. And in that lifetime, maybe, there were social pressures, there was a lack of education, there, whatever it might be, there were harmful influences in our young life that led us down certain decisions that led to all kinds of unethical behaviors. Um, so every sentient being is the same in that we have acted in these ways, when those causes and those conditions came together, but that doesn't have any relationship to the fundamental nature of the mind itself. Those, that coming together of causes and conditions. Um, only existed maybe for that one lifetime, and then the next lifetime maybe different causes and conditions arose, or maybe there was a process where that that sentient being made progress, small incremental progress, like because maybe someone intervened, someone helped them to make better decisions, and then they got on a different track, and then they kept that momentum going for a while. So it's changeable, right? It's not like if a sentient being is a particular way in a particular lifetime, and that's not a commentary on the nature of their mind itself, because their mind isn't one with, we've talked about how the afflictions are not one with the mind. They are adventitious, right? They are removable from the mind. So every sentient being is a potential future Buddha, regardless of what kind of actions they are displaying, how obscured their mind seems to be at a particular time. Every sentient being is a future potential fully enlightened being. So we're trying to see sentient beings from that perspective and not the perspective of, well, they're engaging in non-virtue and therefore they're hopeless. They're beyond my love. They're beyond my compassion. We try not to think in that way. So we have to develop that equal regard that sees all sentient beings as equally deserving of love, of compassion, of our own goodwill, of our own efforts, and not say, well, my friends are deserving of that, and strangers are a little bit, maybe sometimes deserving of that, and my enemies deserve only pain and suffering, and they deserve nothing of my goodwill, nothing of my. That way of thinking has to be overcome. Um, and you do that by, again, this contemplation of seeing that these categories are insubstantial, they're changeable, they're not, you're not getting, it's just the ego, really. It's just, I prefer to be treated this way. And therefore, I'm attracted to people who do treat me this way. I prefer not to be treated this way. So, therefore, I'm averse to people who treat me this way. And but that's not taking into account that that person that we find that we feel averse to has been our own mother countless times over beginningless past lives. They've been our best friend. They've been our mentor. They've been, kind to us in many, many ways. So when we see that all sentient beings are playing all of these different roles again and again and again, then we can develop this equal regard. We can avoid that sort of egoistic way of thinking where we're separating them into these categories. And once we do that, we become capable of developing bodhicitta, of training the mind in bodhicitta. Any thoughts or questions so far? Okay. So there's two ways, two meditative techniques for training the mind in bodhicitta. For what what that means is for basically becoming a bodhisattva, becoming someone who is so familiar with the wish to achieve enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings that every action that they engage in is only intended to bring about that result. So the first of these two meditative techniques is called the six causes and one effect meditation, or the seven. Sometimes it's also called the 7 point cause and effect meditation. Different ways of translating. Um, but what it's getting to is that there are six contemplations that bring about the effect of bodhicitta. So we're going to go through these six causes that bring about the effect of bodhicitta. So step one, or the first cause, is to recognize all sentient beings as having been one's mother. So again, as I mentioned, from the Buddhist perspective, this is presented as just mathematically true. So basically, you contemplate the beginningless nature of the mind, and you contemplate therefore, inevitably, every sentient being has played that role, played the role of one's mother. So you just think about that, in meditation again and again, until you can, when you see a sentient being, you think of them as having, because, I mean, the idea here too is that if you think about the mother or the father that you had in this life, the biological mother or father that you had in this life, if that person has passed away, um, and let's say you have a photograph of that, that mother, that father, you don't, and then someone comes over, you don't say, "Oh, that person used to be my mother." You say, "That's my mother." Say, "This is a picture of my mother." Who's now deceased or who's now, but this is my mother, right? They don't stop being that because they have passed away. Um, and so it's the same idea, right? Just because that in that previous life, that person and also you have died out of that particular incarnation, that relationship is still valid, right? They still were that for that lifetime. And so they still are that. They still, you could still say that they were that. And so they still are that, because it's the same mind, right? It's the same, that the body and the mind have separated, but the mind is just now in a different form, just like the form of your mother when she was 20 and the form of your mother when she was 80. I mean, it's quite different physically. I mean, the same body, but 20 and 80, it's quite different form. So you could say that they've just transitioned in a more dramatic way, but still that relationship, you can think of it as still being just as validly existent as the biological mother of this lifetime when that person has passed. So when we can really look at any sentient being and regard them in that way, then we've kind of had a realization of this first step that all sentient beings have played that role of the mother. And this is sort of a cultural idea in Tibetan Buddhism because from what I understand in Tibet itself as a country, the fathers didn't really have a big role in the raising of children. They were kind of off, collecting food and doing all of the kind of late, and it was really the mother who raised the child. So in Tibetan culture they associate sort of nurture and kind, particularly with the female, and so that's why it's not father or mother and father, but really we can just think of like caregiver in a general sense rather than like the literal female archetype of caregiver. So then step two is to recognize the kindness of all of these mother sentient beings. So, and that literally does mean contemplating what goes along with playing the role of one's mother, meaning, that person carried us in their womb. They tried to be protective of us while we were in the womb. And then when we were born, they fed us, they clothed us, they educated us, they kept us safe from the environment. It isn't to say that, it isn't necessarily to think about really heroic, examples, but just the ordinary kinds of kindness that caregivers provide: education, food, clothing, warmth, protection, that sort of the sort of ordinary things that parents do for their children. So you literally, with this contemplation, you make lists and of all of these different things that are common that a caregiver would provide for a child. Um, and you think about those over and over and over again in meditation, uh, in order to understand that that applies, that every sentient being that you see acted in that way toward you. They didn't just give birth to you, they actually showed all of these kind. I mean, just the act of giving birth is a kindness, because that provides you the ability to, I mean, even if a person doesn't have maybe the capacity to raise a child. Maybe they have to give that child up for adoption, because of their circumstances or whatnot. But even just the act of giving life is a kindness, because then that life can be used in the pursuit of enlightenment, right? And without that, that's not possible, right? We need a human life in order to pursue enlightenment. So even if that's all that it was, I mean, that is still a kindness. But in general, there are additional, kindnesses that persist beyond that. That's most common. So you kind of think about all of those ways, and then you try to generalize that and see all sentient beings as having been kind to oneself in those ways again and again and again in past lives. So that's the second cause of developing bodhicitta. So then, step three, the third cause, is generating the wish to repay that kindness. So, and basically, this step, in the teachings, what they would say is that this step flows pretty organically from just the previous contemplation. Once you become deeply familiar with all of the ways in which you were shown kindness, then the wish to repay that kindness pretty naturally, organically flows from that. If you've really, really done that work and thinking about, oh, I received this benefit and I received that benefit and I received that benefit, then your heart just kind of naturally opens and softens to that. And you're like, oh, what can I do to repay that kindness? So then step four is to generate love toward all mother sentient beings. So, love is the wish for sentient beings to be happy and to have. That's the definition of in English, whatever the Maitri, the word love, um, that is yeah, the word Maitri, which is translated into English as the word love. The definition of that is the wish for all sentient beings to be happy and to have the causes of happiness. So we generate that toward all mother sentient beings by contemplating um, the ways in which sentient beings are not truly happy. We think about, the obstacles that they face to happiness. And so we've just thought about that they've all been our mother, they've all been kind to us, we are motivated to work for their benefit. And then we think about, well, these kind mother sentient beings are bereft of real, because they're ordinary sentient beings, they're stuck cycling within samsara. And so necessarily, they are not really, truly, perfectly happy by definition. Because you can't be really, truly, genuinely, perfectly happy and also be stuck cycling within samsara. So we really try to generate in our mind this strong wish for them to be genuinely happy, and to possess the causes of genuine happiness. And then step five is to generate compassion for all mother sentient beings. So this is also called great love and great compassion. These, because it applies. If you have love or compassion for a single sentient being, that's great, right? That's good. But the phrase "great compassion" or "great" means that you're generalizing that to every single sentient being, without exception. So compassion is the wish for sentient beings to be free of suffering and the causes of suffering. So, love is the wish for sentient beings to be happy and to possess the causes of happiness. Compassion is the wish for sentient beings to be free of suffering and the causes of suffering. So, here, not only do you contemplate that sentient beings ordinarily are all wishing to be happy and they are never really being successful in that. Um, but you also now contemplate that these sentient beings are meeting actively with difficulties, with sufferings, with painful conditions. Um, and on the basis of understanding that these kind mother sentient beings again and again are meeting with painful conditions, you naturally would develop the wish for them to be completely free of these negativities, these sufferings. Um, so that's the fifth step. So then the sixth step is here what's called the uncommon attitude of universal responsibility. Um, So with this, you've gone through the first five stages of this, right? You understand that every sentient being has been one's mother. They've been incredibly kind to oneself. They are deeply wishing to be happy. They are deeply wishing to be free of suffering. You yourself now also on behalf of them, for them, you wish that for them. You wish them to be happy. You wish them to be free of suffering. Um, and now you are getting to a point where you actually take responsibility for bringing that about. You don't just think, well, all of these kind mother sentient beings, yes, I wish they were happy. I wish they were free of suffering. And so I hope some other sentient being comes along and accomplishes that, creates that for them. You don't think in that way. You think, I myself will bring that about. I myself will install every kind mother sentient being into a state that is free of suffering, that is a state of perfect, genuine, real, lasting happiness, contentment, bliss, joy. I will take responsibility for all sentient beings and take responsibility for bringing them into that state rather than just thinking, oh, well, wouldn't it be great if that were true? Wouldn't it be great if all sentient beings were free of suffering? But really, I'm hoping that some other person will do that. We don't think in that way. We think, even if I myself alone have to be the one who brings every single sentient being to a state of complete freedom from suffering, a state of perfect, genuine, lasting happiness. I will do whatever is necessary, whatever is needed to bring them to that state. Um, so that we generate this resolve, this determination to bring all sentient beings to the state of enlightenment, because that is what is um, the state that is characterized by complete freedom from suffering and real, genuine, lasting, perfect happiness. Um, so then it's not listed here, but step 7 is um, the is bodhicitta, the wish to achieve enlightenment for for the benefit of all sentient being. That's the result. These are the 6 steps that lead a person to that result of develop wanting to achieve enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings, because we realize that that's the only way to make good on that this on what we've taken responsibility to do, right? With step 6, we're taking on this task of bringing all sentient beings to a state where they can experience real, genuine happiness and where they can be free of all negativity. And we recognize that we're not capable of that at present, like we were just talking about earlier. You know, we recognize that we ourselves are an ordinary sentient being at present, right now. And as an ordinary sentient being right now, it's ludicrous to say that we can make good on this um, this attitude of having taken responsibility for the welfare of all others, because we ourselves are under the influence of all of these same afflicted states, right? We ourselves are subject to all, attachment and aversion and ignorance and all of these afflicted states. And as long as that's true, we are we are in danger, of taking rebirth in the lower realms. We are in danger of just endlessly cycling within cyclic existence and never being able to accomplish what we have said we want to do. So the only option is for oneself to achieve enlightenment so that we can therefore work for the benefit of all sentient beings. There's no other way in which we can make good on this promise apart from achieving enlightenment oneself, which gives one the ability to bring all sentient beings to their respective enlightenment. So then that's the result of these 6 steps is I will therefore now I will pursue enlightenment single pointedly, wholeheartedly, with all of my actions of body, speech, and mind. I will pursue the goal of my enlightenment so that I'm capable of bringing all other sentient beings to their enlightenment. So that's the 6 point cause and effect meditation that generates, or is one way of training the mind in bodhicitta. Any questions about? So there's a second method for training the mind in bodhicitta, which is called equalizing and exchanging self for other. And here, self is kind of shorthand for self-cherishing. So what it's really saying is equalizing and exchanging self-cherishing for cherishing others. Oh, so this idea of equalizing and exchanging self for others, it is a different way of approaching the process of achieving of training the mind in bodhicitta, we just looked at how the previous method was very much rooted in this idea of all sentient beings having been one's mother, thinking about their kindness, wishing to repay their kindness. So, in a way, that way of thinking is leveraging sort of a transactional model. It's kind of thinking, well, it's not that different than thinking, well, I received something and so I want to give something, right? But the difference is that we're just generalizing from whom we received something. We're trying to get to the point where we understand that we got something from every single sentient being. So we want to give something to every single sentient being, but it's still kind of a transactional way of thinking. Like these sentient beings were my mother, and because they were my mother, I want to benefit them. And that's kind of the premise is that they were kind to me, so I want to be kind to them. I want to repay their kindness, and the best way that I can repay their kindness is to bring them to enlightenment. Um, but equalizing and exchanging self for other doesn't depend on that transactional model. It approaches it from a different perspective where we don't think about it in those terms. We think of sentient beings simply as suffering sentient beings. Um, and it doesn't matter what that they have been kind to oneself. What matters is that we ourselves have been stuck on self-cherishing. We have been stuck on looking after only what is in our interest, trying to that that we go through the world trying to make things work out just for oneself, trying to get what we think we deserve, trying to get what, makes us happy, and disregarding the needs of others, disregarding the value, the intrinsic value of every other sentient being, irrespective of any benefit that they at any time gave to us. Um, so with this, we are kind of flipping that orientation, that way of thinking about sentient beings. We don't think of them um, in a transactional way at all. We simply think, well, what's keeping me trapped in cyclic existence is my default state of only looking after my own interests, only looking after what I think is good for me. And if I can begin to just think that all of these sentient beings are suffering and they are never really happy, and they just like just like oneself, I, based on my familiarity with self-cherishing, I know that I'm motivated to be happy. I'm motivated to be free of suffering. But that's true of all other sentient beings as well. That's their core motivation. They deeply wish to be happy. They deeply wish to be free of suffering. And they are numberless. They are limitless in scope. And so it's just fundamentally irrational that I should spend my life looking after just my own interests, just trying to take from society or, manipulate things in a way that to where they're going to work out in a way that I enjoy or in a way that I think is best for me. What really makes the most sense is for me to work for the benefit of every sentient being without exception. Because I am not more deserving of achieving a state of happiness and freedom from suffering than any other sentient being is. Every sentient being has an equal claim to being happy, to being free from suffering. So, the most logical, most reasonable, most useful thing to do with my life is to work for the benefit of every sentient being, to replace self cherishing with cherishing others, and working for the good of every sentient being. So it completely avoids that sort of transactional model that the 6 point cause and effect method, sort of in a way depends upon. And it gets right at the heart of the mind of self-cherishing that only cares about oneself, that doesn't really, isn't really concerned about others. And it tries to see through that and cultivate a mind that cares about others even more than one is interested in one's own desires, one's own preferences, one's own interests. Okay. So they do say that this second one is a bit more difficult because it's they say that this is that many people will find it maybe easier. I mean, both of these methods are valid methods for developing bodhicitta. They both work. They both can lead to you can become a bodhisattva using either approach. Um, and they say, and so people are generally, I would say, working with both. They're not necessarily just saying, oh, well, I'm only going to try this, or they're kind of working with both approaches. um, but generally they would say that for many people that first approach, which kind of has this familiar transactional quality to it, is a bit easier to grasp, and it's a bit it's maybe a bit easier to work with. um, but these are two methods that are both used. Okay. And so this slide is just talking about the three types of morality that was alluded to in a previous slide. Um, when it talked about bodhicitta. So the three types of morality are purifying existing non-virtue, or non-virtue that's already been created, either in this life, or in previous lives. So we talked a bit about that last time. That's the four opponent powers. So purifying negativities, and then restraining ourselves from engaging in new negativities. Trying to guard our karma, trying to not doing our best at least to not create more negative karma than what's already been created, and then accumulating virtue. So going out of our way, finding opportunities to engage in actively virtuous activities, things that are um, actively beneficial for others. So these are the three types of morality: purifying, restraining, and accumulating. And that's the last slide that I have for class 4. Since there weren't any questions, we went through it faster than normal. Did you have any questions about anything? Right? No, I think we could just leave it there then, if that's all.